Okay, I think it's time to begin. Welcome to Solve Climate by 2030, the Oklahoma edition. My name is Lynn Soreghan, and I'm director of the School of Geosciences at the University of Oklahoma. I'm co-organizing Oklahoma's Solve Climate webinar, together with Dr. Zev Trachtenberg of Environmental Studies and Dean Mike Stice of OU's College of Earth and Energy. Climate change is real and daunting. Our goal is to convey hope and action. There are tangible steps we can all take to help address the climate crisis. We're about to hear from 4 speakers who will each take a few minutes to tell us how we can engage. Our panelists are Oklahomans and experts in their subject matter. We'll begin with a brief introductory video from the Solve Climate National organizers, and then each panelist will speak for 8 to 10 minutes. After all 4 have presented, we'll take questions, and please remember to type your questions into the Q&A feature. Okay, Zev, I think the video's up next, correct?
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 U.S. states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change, while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much-needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice, and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students, and then afterwards have a 1-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world, asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Okay, so without further delay, let's begin with our first panelist, Edith Wilson, founder and owner of Rock Whisperer, where she works to engage emerging professionals in energy solutions and consults on renewable energy and climate mitigation projects. Edith holds degrees in geology and has worked in energy for much of her career. Edith, please begin.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. I'm delighted to be here with you all. Good afternoon, everyone, and so glad you could all join this important discussion on climate change. I'm going to begin with a little bit more exploration of the problem from the point of view of Oklahoma. So I'm showing you a map from Climate Impact Labs of average summertime temperatures across the US. And I'd like you to keep focused here in Oklahoma, where we're all sitting. And you can see our average summer temperatures around 80 degrees. Most of the US, maybe 2/3 of the US, has an average summer temperature that's a little cooler than this. And a few parts, maybe 10%, have some fairly severe average summer temperatures, like down here in southwestern Arizona. So keep your eye on Oklahoma as we move forward a couple of decades and a couple more to the end of the century. And now you see that where we're sitting has an average summer temperature more like what we're observing in southwestern Arizona today, hot, dry, and in fact, all of the US is hotter on average than Oklahoma has been for the past couple of decades, with very few areas that are still in a cool range during the summer. And we've all begun to see the impacts of this. We've begun to see floods, coastal erosion, increasing severity of hurricanes along the Gulf, and drought in the upper Midwest and West with fires. So the scope of the problem is here. It's in our backyard, and sometimes it seems incredibly huge and unattainable from a single point of view. But what I want to do is to sort of lead you through a couple of the things that are happening in the energy transition that are moving us very much in the right direction of having a global and a national impact on arresting the worst features of climate change. And I'm going to try to encapsulate the energy transition for you in one picture, because I think what's happening is really fairly remarkable in the implications that it has for our society as a whole. We all know that how we use energy has contributed 60–75% to the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change and global warming. And how we use energy is changing radically as we sit here today. For the past tens of thousands of years, certainly for the past 1,000 years and century, we have used combustion of hydrocarbons to create energy, from burning wood in fires to burning natural gas in our stoves today. And hydrocarbons as an energy storage device rely on capture of energy from the sun through photosynthesis and storage of that in the resulting hydrocarbons that are made. but hydrocarbons store their energy from the sun in the hydrogen-carbon bond. And they then, when they are used, are destroyed. So in order to capture all of that energy, to drill the well, to run the pipeline, to run the transmission line, or the electricity plant, and to use those hydrocarbons, takes approximately 400 to 500 grams of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour, emits that much CO2 when we use hydrocarbons. Plus, hydrocarbons are finite in their resource on a human time scale. And again, we destroy them for every kilowatt hour of energy we use based on hydrocarbons. The material that stored that energy is gone forever. On the other hand, where we are moving as an energy economy is to use renewable energy resources directly from the sun or from wind, and to store that energy in batteries. Now, in batteries, energy is stored in electrons, or in the conductive metals and nonmetals that can move those electrons back and forth. And to even manufacture, of course, the batteries, the wind, the solar panels, the wind turbines, that requires some emission of carbons, but it's an order of magnitude less, and it's getting less every day, that per kilowatt hour than hydrocarbons require. So we are storing energy from renewable resources. We are using less carbon, or emitting less carbon, in order to make those storage vehicles and those energy transmissions. But then we're also preserving all those components at end of life. So we're moving from a system where we're using up a resource and destroying it and creating carbon when we do so, to a system that's using renewable energy and is based on recyclable, repurposed, reused components. And we're not destroying everything that we can't replace within the human lifespan. So I think there's really good news on a global basis on an energy transition front. And it's even more important than just all the chemical stuff that I'm showing you on this slide. What it means for us in a real life sense is that we're going from this beautiful craftsman home on the upper left side of the slide that was built, probably in 1910. To get energy into that household required an enormous amount of money to be invested, wells to be drilled, pipelines to be run, trucks running back and forth with oil, transmission lines to be built, a ton of infrastructure, a lot of capital investment. It was expensive and time consuming. In the new world, as I've represented with this photo of a couple of women working to install electricity on a small home in Kenya, in the new world, we're looking at going to a hardware store and buying an off-the-shelf solar panel, installing a small lithium-ion battery with some crimpers and pliers and a little bit of construction know-how, and having our own distributed energy resource that we control and we manage, and does not require all of that investment and infrastructure from the beginning. So not only is it a difference in how we impact climate with our energy usage, but it's very much a difference in our ability to create energy equity across the globe, and to push energy out into the control of individuals. So a really, really striking difference the energy transition is bringing. So then we ask ourselves, okay, so if that's happening on a chemical side and in a business basis, what can I do? And that's the point I want to get to with the remaining few minutes of my discussion today. And whenever anybody tells me you should do this to make a difference to something that's important, I always ask myself, well, is what they're telling me to do, is it really going to have an impact? And I want to share with you something that I was first introduced to about 18 months ago, and that's the ability that we all have now, and there's several of them on Google, to go out and look at what elements of change actually make a difference to climate change. What is the real impact of all these things we can do? Now, this particular global CO2 calculator is called the Global Calculator, globalcalculator.org. You can go out and find it. It's very complex. It has a fabulous engine behind it, but it's also really well described and documented on the web. And so after a few practices, you can kind of get the handle of it. But all I want to talk to you about today are 3 results. And these are canned results that are available for you to look at. And so the graphs on the left show the differences in the 3 scenarios. The scenario at the top is if we do nothing, if we essentially leave things the way they are. And you can see in that graph of greenhouse gas emissions on the left at the top, that greenhouse gases just continue to rise and then sort of plateau off at some unknown pace. And this gray of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions rapidly exceeds the allowable amount to keep us at 2 degrees of warming. And in fact, we would be looking in this scenario of doing nothing at 4 to 5 degrees of global warming. So what about some other things that we can do? Well, I've chosen 2 scenarios. One is if we change the way we get around, if we change our transportation, our automobiles, if we change how often we fly, and a few other things related to building heat and air. And if we do these things, and we do them very quickly, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, keep cumulative emissions below that 2 degree threshold, and keep our global warming at about 2 degrees. So yes, it can make a difference how we use transportation. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. I know some of our other panelists are going to talk about it. But I want to move to the last diagram here, which is what we can do individually with how we eat. And it turns out that if there is a radical change in diet across the globe, together with some small changes in land use that sort of go along with that, we can also radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, keep those greenhouse gas emissions below the 2 degree threshold, and keep our global warming to 1 to 2 degrees. So I like this calculator as kind of a test. Is what they're telling me to do really going to make a difference? Well, yes, this tells me that it will. So I've pulled an impact of foods on climate change, on CO2 equivalence emissions from one of my favorite resources, The Visual Capitalist. But there are many others of these out on the web that you can pull up and use as a guide. Now, in this case, what we're plotting are various different foods versus the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product in CO2 equivalent. So, for example, if I am eating peas, those peas have a greenhouse gas emission in CO2 equivalent of just under a kilogram per kilogram of product that I eat. Okay, so that's what this diagram is showing. And the colors refer to what part of the production chain is creating that CO2 emission, that greenhouse gas emission. So for example, we go from changes in how land is used to farming processes, to the animal food processing, transport, retail, and packaging. Now, overall, I want you to notice that most of the carbon emissions come from the blue and the aqua, the land use and the farming. Very, very little of the, on a percentage basis of the carbon emission actually comes from processing, transport, retail, and packaging. Some, but most of the lever here is on the farming and land use side, and I'm going to show you why. So at the bottom, you see my corn growing. If you think that food equals carbon, remember every protein, every carbohydrate has carbon in it. So every time you move up the consumption chain, you concentrate that carbon. So if I'm eating bananas or peas or wheat or peanuts, that's something that's grown. I've chosen the example here of the cow eating the corn. Right? So this is corn. If I eat corn, I produce very little greenhouse gas emissions. If I drink the milk from the cow who is eating the corn and concentrating that carbon, then I produce a little more carbon greenhouse gas emissions from drinking that milk. If I eat the cow who's made the milk and consumed all of this corn, then my product is up here in beef, and I'm 60 times the greenhouse gas emissions than if I just ate the corn. So the message here is to push your way as far down the food chain as you possibly can, right? So I want to show you in particular what impacts this huge green aqua swath here by showing you my favorite slide. And I know that many of you may be middle school teachers, perhaps joining us for this, but this is why that farming process is so productive of greenhouse gases. It's because of cows and rumination. To just digest the food, the process by which the cows digest the corn that they eat and everything else creates methane, and the cows burp and fart. So burping and farting is some of the worst greenhouse gas emissions that we can possibly have. And that's why our little friendly cow here is at the top of the pack, but also other ruminants, lamb and mutton, have a huge farm methane emission. So I wanted to show you that slide because there really is a true impact of that. Now, the other thing that we all know is that there is a distinct connection between eating meat and obesity. And eating meat, meat eaters are 3 times more likely to be obese than vegetarians, and up to 9 times more likely than vegans. But so there is this impact as well on health that comes from eating down in the food chain here. But I asked myself, what impact does that have on us in today's world? And I have been looking with some curiosity and lack of understanding at maps of COVID death rates as we look out through the pandemic. And I'm a geologist, so I look for trends in maps that make sense in the natural world. And I look at this map and I see large areas of very low death rate and some concentrated areas of very high death rate. And I see almost no relationship to latitude, longitude, even economic development among those trends. Well, as with so many things, I was illuminated by a graph from the New York Times recently, which showed this very distinct break from low death rate to much higher death rate. And obviously there are other things going on here with increasing percentage of obesity rate in the population. So what I offer to you is here is something you can do that not only will have a phenomenal and direct impact on mitigating the effects, the worst effects of climate change, but also is good for you as a human. You can impact the health of the planet, and you can impact your own health with this dietary choice of moving down the carbon food chain. Think about, like our little friendly cow says, think about what can I do? Think about what you eat, how it's grown, and most importantly, make your choices from some sort of list like this. Now for me, and I'm going to wrap up in just a sec here, but for me, the difficulty is I love cheese, chocolate, and coffee. So what I do, I have a little bit of cheese. I occasionally have a bite of chocolate. I have some coffee most mornings. And then I leave out all the beef, all the lamb and mutton, all the chicken, and I stick with wild caught fish and everything else plant-based. So I can tell you that, that it is both healthy for me and healthy for the planet to do this. And this is the one thing that I want to leave you with to do. Visual Capitalist, if you haven't doom scrolled through their stuff, they're great. That's where this list comes from, and you can find it yourself. You can pull your global calculator from globalcalculator.org. So thank you very much for letting me be part of your afternoon, and I hope that you find this is something you can do to impact climate change.
Thank you, Edith. And I see there are some really great questions in the chat. We will get to those at the end, so please stick around for that. Our next panelist is Dirk Spiers, founder and president of Spiers New Technology. Dirk is a pioneer in advanced batteries and energy storage systems and has experience in solar and wind technologies. So Dirk, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I don't think, hold on, I'm off mute, good. I don't think I can do as beautiful a presentation as Edith just did, but I have a story to tell. Why do I drive electric vehicles, an electric vehicle, and why do I think that is a better alternative than a combustion vehicle? So number one, less pollution means less smoke. And if you run in an open space like Lake Hefner, if a car passes you, you smell the car, and that shows you how bad it is. And a diesel car is even worse because there's also a lot of particle matter. So one of the reasons I drive an electric vehicle, it pollutes less, which is important. Number two, different but equally important, less CO2, less greenhouse gases. In the United States, we use about 9 billion barrels of oil a year, and about 2/3 goes to transportation. So if we can move all to electric vehicles, we significantly will reduce the need for gasoline, for petroleum and everything. Number three, and this has nothing to do with the climate, but it's still pollution, noise pollution. I think it is often forgotten, but noise is not good. I know in Oklahoma, they get very happy when they have a rumbling V8, and it's a great sound for many, many people here. But it's not when it's next to you in the street or next to you out of the window where your kids sleep and everything. Noise is not a good thing. And then the fourth thing is I hate to give my money to the very same companies who come up with whatever research to prove that climate change is a hoax and mislead the population. I don't like to sponsor the people who manipulate the media, the press, you name it. So for me, that are the four reasons I drive electric, and I've been driving electric for, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years. But then where does the electricity come? And the electricity comes from the grid. And luckily for us in Oklahoma and almost everywhere, the grid is getting cleaner every year. And even more so in Oklahoma, and it surprised me, you know, with all the wind going up, coal is going offline, and renewables is now the fastest growing source of energy. Also, if you have to choose pollution in the middle of nowhere, is better than pollution coming out of a tailpipe, because that tailpipe is in your street, in your city center, etc., etc. Then I already saw quite a few questions about not only where's the electricity coming from, where are the minerals, the metals coming from, and they indeed are being mined, like cobalt, nickel, lithium. There's plenty of lithium. But the beautiful thing about batteries, and we have a facility here in Oklahoma City, is that battery is almost fully recyclable, and the black powder can be refined into an hydroxide or a metal sulfate, and eventually goes back into a new battery pack. So you truly have a fully, closed loop system. Then another reason why electric vehicles are better is the efficiency. There's a combustion engine about less than 20% is being used to propel you from A to B. The rest of that energy is wasted in friction and in heat. So think about it. You go to a Starbucks, you get a coffee, or maybe not a coffee anymore, but a drink. and 80% of that glass, of that cup, is being tipped over, but you still pay for it. And that is really, really bad. And the beautiful thing of an electric motor is it has an efficiency of more than 90%. So 90% of the energy you put in is being used to go from A to B. So that are these sort of, efficiency things. And then to close it off from a practical point of view, I think an electric vehicle is more fun to drive. It has instant torque. There's no noise. You have more interior space and better interior space. You don't have the drive shaft going through the car. You don't have a big block of steel or aluminum in the footwell or in front of the footwell, which is also dangerous. Lower total cost of ownership. You don't have maintenance or a lot less maintenance. No oil changes. All that kind of stuff is done and over. I hate personally gasoline stations because you always have to go for a tank of gas when you're running late to catch a plane or a meeting or whatever. No dirty hands, important in the COVID time. You can charge at home. Every morning you have a full charge. And then finally, where is the electric vehicle going? They're getting better every year. The range is going up. The cost is coming down. Outright total cost of ownership is already cheaper. But I would say within 2 or 3 years, outright cost to purchase one will be lower than a combustion engine. The Chevy Volt, which was one of the first electric vehicles in the United States, came out in December 2010. The cost per kilowatt hour of that battery pack was $1,200 per kilowatt hour, $1,200. Now the cost per kilowatt hour in volume for a battery pack is probably $120, $130. So that gives you, an idea of how much costs are coming down. And it's very similar to what you see with solar and wind. Range, even though the majority of people don't drive more than 40 miles in the United States per day, range of a typical EV is 200, will be 350 miles over time. And then charging, commercial chargers, level 3 chargers, up to 80% in less than 20 minutes. So that's why I believe in electric vehicles. $300 billion is being invested by the automotive industry into electrification, into electric vehicles. It is here to stay. We really see a tremendous transformation, not only in how do we generate energy, but also in mobility. And that's it from me. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dirk. And there are some questions. So again, we will get to those. Our next panelist is Sharina Perry, founder and inventor with Utopia Plastics. Sharina has a passion for environmental justice and strives to address the needs of those who've been disadvantaged by land misuse and economic hardship. Sharina, take it away. Sharina, I think you're muted still.
There we are. Is that better? Thank you all for joining us today. We'll jump right in. As Lynn mentioned, I am very passionate about sustainability, our land use, and our natural resources, leading me to obtain an advanced certification in sustainability and circular economics. As we discussed in the beginning video that you heard, this is a global issue, and that we all must work to address this issue of solving climate by 2030. Let's begin. Right now, what we really want to address is the issue of sustainability. What does it really mean? What's the impact on our natural resources? What companies are leading the way? And what we can intentionally do to affect the issue. When we talk about sustainability, it's really defined globally by looking at society, environment, and economics. The US adopted the standard of the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. So how whatever we chose to do, whether it was individually, as businesses, or government agencies, what did we do to impact what happens to our natural resources? Traditionally in the past, businesses have adopted what has come to be known as a cradle to grave approach to our resources, meaning that we take our natural resources, we use them to make products, and then we dispose of them. That's known as a linear economy. The idea of sustainability seeks to change that narrative by taking a cradle to cradle approach, meaning we look at our natural resources, we make products, we use them, and then we try to figure out another way to reuse them and reinsert them in our natural supply chain. We have to figure out a solution, and that solution is often found in our circular economy. Now, we achieve it also by what we call sustainable consumption. It's actually the use of products, services, materials, and energy in a way that has a minimal impact on the environment and society. The idea is to use a specific product for as long as possible and extract as much value from that product or asset as possible, then reuse that product or component or material to produce new things. That means now we look at our production differently. We look at our natural resources, we manufacture products, then the waste from that product doesn't actually become waste, but it actually serves as a benefit to us. There are companies that are leading the way globally in the standard that they set. I intentionally chose companies we're familiar with, and how we can actively participate is by examining, researching, and using companies that in our natural products that we use daily. Nestle has perhaps been identified as an industry leader for their appreciation and achievement in what they've done, both in receiving industry best scores in the economic, environmental, and social impact. It goes beyond the products that we use, but it addresses embedded in their culture, human rights in their supply and management policies, industry leadership in health and nutrition, as Edith mentioned, health and nutrition being a significant part. And they've also been awarded an environmental score of 100 in the selling of products and running processes that are environmentally and socially friendly. Another way Nestle leads the way is also in their association and partnering with local farmers, particularly in their biogas plants, to create green energy that helps farmers receive environmentally friendly manure, and this helps the farmer in taking care of local environment projects. Another company is Ikea. Ikea is leading the way by the use of cotton in its renewable furniture, using better plastics. They also, a key natural resource that they use is bamboo. And they also are creating affordable furniture and energy saving appliances with their recycled material and bamboo. They also are interested in reducing food waste by simply encouraging packing a lunch, keeping vegetables fresher longer, and using UTZ certified teas and coffees. Another company we're familiar with is LG in using its reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and it aims to reduce that emissions by 40% and have a 15% increase in greenhouse in new businesses, in their new businesses. They've also reduced the total greenhouse gas emissions over the years by 353,000 tons. The reduction in packaging weight, they've reduced that in the weight of packaging and logistical costs through green packaging guidelines. They have community initiatives. They've invested over 91% in the social investment budget into communities with initiatives to develop accessibility apps for public use. Nike, another company. In the Nike Air, many people are not familiar with it, but that technology was designed to consist of pressurized nitrogen air inside the sole of their shoes. There are some additional sustainability facts with Nike. The dye coloring process allows 99% of the recoverable dye water to be recycled. All the air soles are designed since 2008 have been composed of 50% recycled manufactured waste. Nike's air innovation facilities divert more than 95% of their manufacturing waste from landfills. And so the new Nike Air 2017, which has been updated, boasts the most visible cushioning system that was developed. Within our own organization, Utopia, we attempted as well to develop a model that incorporated farming, processing, manufacturing, and distribution. And we did that by addressing the environmental issues around crops used in creating our polymers. We chose crops that absorb carbon from the atmosphere more than any other crop. About 1.52 tons of CO2 is needed for production of 1 ton of dry matter. Every hectare in our material consumed, or every hectare in what we use to produce our material is 30 to 40 tons of CO2 for each growing cycle. During a single growing cycle, each hectare consumes the amount of CO2 that exhausts from 20 cars in the whole year. No chemical pest control is needed. Neither toxic nor synthetic products should be applied during our growing cycle. And the crops we use remove toxic elements such as heavy metals from the soil. Our industrial products made with Utopia plastics can also be recycled, and our crops for soil remediation. Now, what do you do? What will you see as a consumer? There are particular identifiers with the products that we purchase that can be found that give a strong indication of the companies that are out there and what they are doing. Many of us familiar with Energy Star, the Global Recycle Standard. These are all part of what we can find. Also, in our, as we move through, I'll just simply guide through the slides of the different identifiers. If you all would take a look, these will be available as well after in the chat. They're a significant number. But the reality is we can also look at how the products themselves that we use, from our shampoo bottles to the packaging for our food, there are identifiable ways of the space in those products and how much that takes up, that it also helps reduce our carbon. Here's another presentation from even our spray bottles to moving to compact designs. So the reality is what we do in circularity and the benefit that it has is simply our goal to reduce the dependence on our new natural resource, reduce waste, reduce costs, and achieve the 3 Ps that have the best and most beneficial impact on our people, planet, and profits.
Thank you, Sharina. And I see there's more questions in the chat, so we'll have a lot of questions. I keep saying chat, I mean Q&A. So hold tight for that. And our final panelist is Lindsey Pever, attorney with A New Energy and vice president of the Oklahoma Solar Association. Lindsey works with mostly renewable energy clients on navigating the regulatory landscape and on public policy. So Lindsey, bring us home.
Thank you, Lynn. Pull this up. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. As Lynn said, I'm Lindsey Pever, and I am excited to be here and talk to you about how we can help solve climate by, hold on one second. I'm so sorry, but I'm having trouble with my view. Okay. How we can solve climate through pointed, positive political participation. One of our focus points at A New Energy Law in Oklahoma City is that space where new technology requires updates or revisions to law and regulation. Among other things, we assist wind farms in achieving commercial operation. We help solar installers understand and comply with new laws, advocate for improved rules at the Corporation Commission, and interpret, explain, and when we're lucky, edit or redraft legislation for industry leaders. We founded the Oklahoma Solar Association to help educate and advocate for Oklahoma to realize its immense solar potential. I have worked as a political campaign manager, a state level lobbyist, a nonprofit fundraiser, and now an attorney with practice primarily before the Corporation Commission. My goal in just the next very few minutes is to help you understand how you can do your part to solve climate by 2030 through pointed, positive political participation. You likely have your why for being here today, and this image represents one of my whys. This graph represents all of Earth's finite and renewable energy reserves in terawatt years. On the right, you have the sum total of all the natural gas, petroleum, uranium, and coal reserves on the planet. On the left is the yearly amount for renewables, wind at the top in green, and that huge yellow sphere is our solar resource. To put this in context, that small orange sphere on the far left represents the world's entire energy use for 1 year. So on the right, those are finite. That's all we have as far as we know. On the left, this is just an annual amount. So infinite, really. This next image is used with the permission of Generation 180. It's a great resource, and I'll refer to it again at the end of the presentation. I use this with their permission, and it just was such a perfect image and illustration of how we can make a difference here. And when I say we, I do mean anyone and everyone with the desire. First, we have to educate ourselves. We have to identify an issue that fuels our passion and then know who makes the decision for us. After all, how do they know what is important to us? Well, they won't unless we communicate. So what does pointed positive political participation even mean? Well, by pointed, I mean direct and unambiguous. Who should we speak with? Well, of course, anyone, but here we'll focus on elected officials. These people are our friends and neighbors. Don't forget that they are normal people who made the decision to run for office, to step up and do something. Remember this when you are speaking with them, and don't be so nervous. In the case of legislators, they are administering your tax dollars after all. But also remember that these people are inundated with people who want something from them. So step into their shoes for a moment. Ask yourself, if you were this person, what do you need to do your job better? Begin your plan with that in mind. For instance, in Oklahoma, we're an oil and gas state. We have been for decades and decades, and it's all about the economy. So we environmentalists have to talk about our goals in those terms. we have to talk about how solar energy is, how solar being as prevalent and beneficial to the state as any oil and gas play. We have to remind our leaders that there are no volatile fuel costs involved when electricity is generated by wind and solar and backed by energy storage. Especially important after this last winter storm event we just had. And we must remind them that well-paying jobs are available in this sector, that all of this amounts to a larger tax base to allocate. So pointed, know your audience, know your topics and your talking points. Positive. Be memorable by being positive. It's not unusual in Oklahoma for people to count the environment or climate issues as secondary or not consider them at all. Since we are trying to change the norm, be positive, smile, be kind and informative. Get remembered. Your goal is to have an elected official ask their assistant after your visitor call, who is that pleasant person who shared that information about climate and just seemed so knowledgeable. Let's call them for this project. Or get forgotten. Remember that grouchy, rude person who's preaching about climate change? Well, we have some control over this storyline. Consider sharing things that we can do to help solve climate issues. Don't focus on what we've done wrong, what we've done in the past, or how dreadful the outlook is without our action. To be positive means to remain optimistic even through tough discussions. Participation. Does all of this sound great to you, but you don't know where to start? Well, first decide on your issue. Is it reducing pollution or greenhouse gases, quicker adoption of electric vehicles, advancing solar, helping underserved people get their fair access to all of the above? Once you identify your issue, suddenly you're not alone. There are so many groups in Oklahoma that can help you with ideas and materials, inspiration, and sometimes, and above all, solidarity. So let's go over how to participate. Who? Anyone who will listen. Family, friends, colleagues, but especially elected officials. Where? So where? All levels of government, local, county, state, and federal. We'll break this down a little bit. Local, in cities and towns. Talk to your city council member or mayor. Learn about the issues they're considering. Right now in Tulsa, the city is considering and currently negotiating its franchise agreement with its local utility. This is an incredible opportunity to make your voice heard and affect real change. These agreements are usually 20 plus years. Do you want to see more renewables in that agreement for electricity? Contact your council member. At the county level, county commissioners make decisions every day about funding for administration and infrastructure, emergency management, and social services, just to name a few. Right now, Oklahoma and Tulsa counties are considering a program called CPACE that would make it easier for building owners to install things like energy efficiency, renewable energy projects, and other similar projects on new and in existing commercial buildings. There is also a residential version of this program. Let your county commissioner know that you support ideas like that. At the state level, there's lots of options to get involved at the state level. You've got the Corporation Commission, the legislature, the Attorney General, and the executive branch, so governor and cabinet members. First, I'm going to focus on the Corporation Commission. It's made up of 3 statewide elected officials who make decisions concerning many facets of our everyday lives. They regulate the oil and gas industry, and so our response to the earthquakes when that was an issue. They regulate transportation, the petroleum storage area, so gas stations, and importantly, they regulate many of our utilities, including electric, water, and gas. This is where decisions are made, such as the rate at which your utility will pay you for the energy that your solar panels put back onto the grid. These commissioners approve utilities plans, their prudency, and the fairness associated with the rates we pay. Like most elected officials, these 3 commissioners encourage contact from their constituents, and they usually do a great job of listening. They have professional staff and understand the issues and are great to work with through regulation and rule changes. The Corporation Commission is not a place many think of when they think of advocating. Perhaps even less so is the Attorney General. Everything I mentioned going on at the Corporation Commission is also being monitored by the Attorney General, yet another elected official. For decisions that impact climate, these two are very important. For citizen advocacy, many people think of the legislature. There you can contact your state or senator or representative and discuss issues of importance to you. Many organizations hold annual Day at the Capitol events, which are a great way to plug in. And finally, there's the federal level. Everything I've said so far can apply to advocacy at the federal level. And some of those resources I'm going to share in just a minute will provide materials for those efforts. So I'll close up with two things: a list of resources you can use right here in Oklahoma, followed by a list of ways I think you can participate in order of their effort. First of all, the Oklahoma Solar Association puts out information and would love to have extra members. The Oklahoma Renewable Energy Council or ORIC is another great organization to join. The Sierra Club, and specifically its Ready for 100 initiatives all over the state and the country. There's Sustainable Tulsa and Tulsa. The national groups that have wonderful talking points and information are Generation 180, Vote Solar, Switch Energy Alliance. Or you can simply do a search for best organizations working on climate issues and see what comes up that inspires you. And finally, how to participate in order of effort. See if you would choose a different order. First of all, I think the easiest thing if you're 18 or older is to vote for people who share your passions. And importantly, vote out people who do not. Along with that, contribute. It can't be done without funds. So if you are able, contribute to candidates who deserve your support. Even a little bit goes a long way. You can write letters. You can handwrite or type a letter over doing an email, but email over doing nothing. Social media. I have to caution not to expect a whole lot of a response to social media. In fact, I would say before you post on social media, think of how your time could be better spent with another idea mentioned. These take just a little bit more effort. Invite elected officials or their staff to your group or Zoom meeting. Call your county, your local offices, your city council member, or even someone from your federal delegation. Go to town halls, rally or protest. There are a lot of productive and even fun options there. And finally, volunteer for candidates, political parties, or a nonprofit organization. Those are all things you can do. And don't forget, be pointed and positive in your political participation. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you all of our panelists. And I think I'd like to, and you stayed on time, perfect. What I'd like to do now is go straight to the Q&A. And I see that Dirk and Edith have already begun to answer some of the questions that came early, but some of the later ones are still open here. So let's see, we have a question about during the pandemic, with the reduction of air travel and vehicle usage, how much did that help us? But if more people worked from home going forward, would that be a game changer? So that's open for any of you to address.
I view the pandemic as a great unplanned experiment. Certainly a lot of negative consequences, but one thing that it proved to us beyond the shadow of a doubt is that if we choose to make a different choice with respect to how much we travel and how much we use office space, we can in fact dramatically reduce CO2 emissions. And shortly after the pandemic, and I don't have the slide to show you, we had a fall off in CO2 emissions that was very dramatic. Now we have recovered and then some since, but it demonstrated that we can impact it by the choices that we make.
I'll make one comment relevant to that question, which is that our emissions fell off But the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere continues to rise because there's a lot of momentum in the Earth system, essentially. However, if we did stop that and do a lot more telecommuting, it would ultimately make a difference. It'll just take time. Any other comments on that question? Here's one that I think, Sharina, you can address. It's what is a better plastic?
Well, there are certainly what we would define as bioplastics that have been developed. Some of the ones that many are familiar with are PLA, which has a base of corn. It's polylactic acid. The idea of a PLA is it is a compostable. It is not a degradable material. It is commercially compostable. Many companies have made the conversion to those types of plastics. In particular, I can say for us, it's using plant-based by the development of using agricultural crops directly, not a byproduct of them, to establish a more eco-friendly. As mentioned in my slide presentation, we particularly use crops that absorb carbon to help with this global initiative in the very creation of our plastics, resin, and using our material in the production of everyday items.
I can answer that question much better than Sharina. A better plastic is a plastic coming from Sharina, because also it comes from our land here in Oklahoma. It involves the whole community and everything. So for me, a better plastic comes from Sharina.
I will add that if we're really looking at people, planet, profits, it's not just about what we reduce. It's also about what we do to benefit. So we use crops that actually replenish nutrients back in the soil. So our soil to soil and our plastics, as Dirk is speaking of, once those break down, they actually put nutrients back into the ground rather than just using that resource. So we look at, are we doing good for people? Are we doing good for our planet? And then are we being able to do that and achieve economic benefit as well, to create a holistic approach?
Great, excellent. It looks like the next question is teed up for Lindsey, which is about, are there initiatives in Oklahoma to transition oil workers to renewable energy workers?
Yes, so there are, and they're growing. Our VOTECs in the state have already begun these efforts. There are VOTECs both in the Oklahoma City metro and then even in the rural areas that are training students and have been for several years now in solar and wind to be technicians for those industries. And it is such a perfect transition from oil workers. They already have a lot of the skills necessary for these jobs. And so you're going to see a lot more of that, especially as we transition away from more oil and gas and more toward the renewables.
And I'll bring up a related question here to Edith, actually, which is, what hope can you offer today's students who are trained to work in one world and now find themselves rather abruptly entering a new place?
Yeah, that's something that I've been really deeply involved with for the past 2 or 3 years, as we've seen the energy business just sort of turn on a dime and very unexpectedly. And I have to say that, yes, there are some phenomenal transitional things that occur and should occur. For example, what Lindsey talked about, but also retraining high-tech coal miners in West Virginia to do what they call blue-collar coding. I mean, it's a great example. I personally think taking all of that oil field expertise and using it to to pull all of the steel out of the ground and recycle it, to plug abandoned wells, to capture methane. You know, there's so much expertise that could be put to use, not in extraction, but in mitigation, and should be, and probably will find some support in some of the new policies that are coming out. But on the other hand, there is a very fundamental change in the business model that I alluded to a little bit in my talk. And more importantly, for the people in the industry, in the culture of the company. I mean, and this is kind of rooted in the fact that the old energy business is very much one of extraction, building things, big capital investment, plumbing, mechanical kind of stuff. And the new energy business is technology. It grows, it changes on a dime. The rate of change is like Silicon Valley, right? It's not, you know, the oil field where it takes us 10 years to really learn how to frack a well. It's a different culture. And I think for a lot of my colleagues who are trying to make that transition, sometimes I think the skills are one thing, but it's the sort of culture and business model that are really, really difficult because they are very different. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that a lot of geoscience research departments are coming to understand is it's important to understand the sociological impacts of things as well as the scientific impacts, and that we have to work together on those things to make this energy transition. So I see a lot of hope for transitioning workers from one to the other, but I wish it were as simple as just applying skills, but I think that the higher barriers to leap are culture and climate, to use a bad pun.
Yeah, and you know, there was another thing, you know, what you just said, but also what Lindsey said. For quite a few people, if you talk about climate change, they dig themselves in, and you can't have a conversation. And you know, that's okay, but the beauty of all those technologies, solar, wind, electric vehicles, and everything, is from an economic point of view, they make sense. You know, solar power is so much cheaper than coal power. And also it is, you know, probably now price competitive, if not less, than gas. And what you start to see right now is that renewables plus battery packs together are really cost competitive against a gas peaker plant. So there's a lot of stuff. So if people don't believe in climate change, you can say, do you believe in the economy, in dollar and cents? And renewables, electric vehicles, from a pure economic point of view, are superior to the technologies they replace. So it's not only, you know, this is an expensive hobby. No. This makes sense from an economic point of view. Plus, it helps the climate.
I couldn't agree more, Dirk. And that same impact is also felt by employees as well, though, because the renewable resources are so much more efficient and less expensive, the jobs are also lower in salary. So when you're talking to a displaced worker, there's a different concern there. And what I'm finding in the people who are making that transition is the ones who are doing it successfully are doing it for reasons other than salary. They're happily engaged in swinging a hammer on a rooftop installation job because they're working for something they're passionate about, or they're starting up a little recycle business, you know, because they're going to buy, drill, flip a big energy project, but because it's making a difference in their community. So, you know, I think that economic argument kind of goes both ways when you're talking about employment, because the salaries are definitely less.
But you know, we employ more and more people, but we pay health insurance, we pay 401k. The oil industry doesn't do it. It's only contractors, and if the going gets tough, they chuck them out. So, you know, when you talk to your representative, and they tell you how wonderful oil is and everything. It's not the case. From a business point of view, the Defunct Tower, more than 50% is empty. So Chesapeake campus is probably 70% empty. So, people who still work there, I'm sure they're getting worried and they want to have a job with, more economic prospects.
Yeah, and to Dirk's point, and to back up what Edith said, it's so true that there's these social and emotional impacts. When your grandfather, maybe even your great grandfather, worked in the oil and gas industry, and that's what you grew up knowing you would do. It's the same in coal mining states, and Oklahoma is behind the 8 ball in this case. So there are great examples in other states that have begun this transition with nonprofits and government, working together to try to find meaningful work for these people. But we're just not quite there yet because of what we've been talking about today, and just that Oklahoma is still an oil and gas state. And we're talking more about being an all of the above state, and we're getting there. But the oil and gas industry isn't just going to go away. And so I think if as a whole we quit pitting, renewables versus, it's hard not to make the distinction on a scientific basis. But if we quit pitting, renewables against, the finite resource people, that's a great place to start. And just letting them know that they're welcome and that there are jobs here when they're ready. So.
I think it also.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sharina.
I think it also comes in developing infrastructures, because as we sit in the Midwest, and like Lindsey mentioned, Oklahoma is an oil and gas state. And so we become very protective of it, in that this means people's lives. It's loss of jobs. It affects us. But if we look outside and look at what are the solutions to that in oil and gas, so you take on a circular economics idea that even involved in oil and gas, how can we use these resources to continue to use the resources to benefit and not put as much pressure on our natural resources, so that we can solve the problem? And I think Oklahoma as a state, if we make investments in those infrastructures that help pull us forward, that help keep people in jobs, that help them move from these labor to technology type of industries, I think we help get there. And I think we also help bridge that gap, so that it does not seem that one industry or industries are being pitted one against the other. For us in particular, we look at combining our materials with polymers made of oil and gas and helping make them eco-friendly. So there are options out there.
Thank you all. That's such an important discussion point in Oklahoma. Lindsey, I think this is one for you. To whom would we speak at the state and federal level to advocate for decentralized energy generation, such as rooftop solar plus storage versus large-scale centralized energy generation?
So at the state level, kind of what I was talking about before, this really is a corporation, commission, and a legislature issue. I'm trying to find the questions in the Q&A so I get it right. It's never a bad time to contact an elected official. So right now after this, you've been inspired by something one of the panelists have said, reach out and get to know your federal delegation or their assistants more likely. And then let them know, what you're interested in. But then on the city level, like I said, in Tulsa, they're looking at their franchise agreement. Well, all they know is their sort of sphere of knowledge about the agreement and what they think their citizens want. And so even one email from someone who knows a little bit could trigger some new motion in this, where it's like, well, we're getting contacted and people are wanting to know that you're going to add more renewables, or people that want to see less coal, or they, you know, obviously are concerned with rates and keeping rates low. And we know that renewables are competitive now. So reaching out to any one of those is a place to start. And also, you know, contacting some of the nonprofits that I mentioned that are already doing that work. And a lot of them will provide you with talking points or even a paragraph that you can copy and paste to contact your, you know, whichever elected official the issue is before. So those are just some other ways. If I didn't completely answer the question, feel free to follow up in the Q&A.
You know, can I add one thing? Because this is really important that you reach out and that you reach out with information. And you put it beautifully, but the information, the majority of people in the capital, the information they get, the majority of information they get comes from lobbyists, from oil and gas industry. That is the source of knowledge they get. So if we reach out to them, and I really hope you do, come with information so that they hear different kinds of information from a different source. That's very, very important. I spend more and more time in the capital and reaching out to people and inviting them to come to our, plant. And I give them information, because if I don't do it, the oil industry does it. And that information is very, very one-sided. So don't only smile and be nice, but be knowledgeable.
Absolutely. And to your point, same with the utilities. I mean, if we're on the topic of solar, the electric utilities have many, you know, lobbyists, both full-time and contract lobbyists up there every day, making, you know, forming relationships and providing that dialogue. So that's who you're up against. So say something. It's better than saying nothing. And from my experience at the Capitol, I know from talking to legislators that if I would go into their office for an issue, they would not hesitate for a second to say, I've got too many constituents that have contacted me about this. I've already made up my mind. And so it truly does work.
Okay, and I'd like to tell everybody sort of the plan and then continue on questions, because we're continuing to get really good questions in the Q&A. So one thing is I wanted to remind the audience that you should be able to see links and some answers in the Q&A. And also the plan here from here on out, we'll continue with some Q&A until about 5:30, and we'll then end the webinar part of this program then, but we'll reconvene in breakout rooms with individual panelists, except for Lindsey, because I know she has another appointment coming up, in a separate Zoom for those who might be interested. So you'll have a chance to speak to the panelist of your choice. And the link to that second Zoom will be in the Q&A and also emailed to you if you registered for the webinar. So just beware of that. And I think I'd like to, I see, let's see, I see one in here that sounds like a Lindsey question. So I want to catch it before Lindsey needs to sign off. And it's this, Lindsey, are there job possibilities in restoring habitat from defunct oil wells around Oklahoma, or in restoring the soils depleted by big agriculture? And again, anyone can answer, of course. But
so OERB is the state organization that that plugs abandoned oil wells. So that is the first place to start, is OERB. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with anyone doing that work for soils, but the first place I would start would be DEQ, the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality. And OERB is the Oklahoma Energy Resources Board.
Great, thank you. Here's another one, and this is for anybody. I was told by an engineer last week that it takes more energy to make a windmill than it will ever produce in its lifetime. Do you know if that's true? That's number one. Number two, they greatly affect the wildlife where they are. Why is that largely ignored? I'm also told they aren't recyclable. Thus, I don't see them as very environmentally friendly. Thoughts?
I'm happy to take a stab at that one if you like, Lynn. There are a number of ways to look at sort of efficiency, if you will. And one of my favorites, and I apologize, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Tiffany, I will include my email or my LinkedIn in the chat before we part so that anybody can follow up. But one of my favorite measures of looking at energy is a ratio called return on energy employed. And that basically looks at, if I take this much, if I produce this much energy, how much energy have I put into it? And obviously you want it to be, you want to produce many, many more times energy than the energy it takes to put into it, just ignoring cost altogether. We already know that wind and solar on a dollar for dollar basis are much lower cost. But if we look at that return on energy employed, what we find is that the highest return is in solar, and it's growing and growing and growing. Beyond that, wind is fairly high. Hydro is pretty high. Geothermal is pretty high. Coal is also pretty high. It takes very little energy to produce coal compared to the energy that it makes. But oil and gas are really interesting because oil used to be, when we drill one well into an artesian reservoir and oil would spring from the ground, oil used to be very high return on energy employed to get it out. But now, because we have to pump all these wells, and that takes energy, electricity, which we see as operating cost in the energy business. Now, an oil well in the Permian Shale Basin, for example, has a very low return on energy employed. And in fact, the oil sands in Alberta, besides being cost prohibitive and environmentally disastrous, have a negative return. In other words, it takes more energy sometimes to get it out than you get from combusting the resulting product. So in fact, there's a really, and of course, all numbers are debatable, but there is a really good measure for looking at that. And what I can tell you is that, in fact, windmills have a very good return on energy employed in general. And of course, the metals that they're made of are recyclable. I don't understand where that would come from. I'm a little bit puzzled by that. And I can't speak to the wildlife, but perhaps someone else can.
Yeah, I can, I mean, just working in the industry, sort of a fact, because that is a very common and very fair and important question, especially about the wildlife. And the studies show essentially that more birds are killed on windshields, car windshields, than any number of turbines that we currently have. So it's not perfect, and it's not without impact to wildlife, but the local entities that sort of regulate and protect wildlife and land use are all in place across the country, and they're protecting, and wind farm siting is, yeah, and I see skyscrapers too. Same idea, but wind farm siting, it takes years. The turbines are put in the right place for federal aviation requirements, for the state Oklahoma aeronautics requirements, and they work with all the different entities to try to lessen the impact. So, and I can also answer, I know that the turbine blades are difficult, the most difficult to recycle. And so you can't just simply recycle those the way you can the other components. But so that's, especially for all our students and engineering students listening, that's the $1 million question. So you can think of what we could do with wind turbine blades. You will be a bazillionaire.
And I'll just echo that as well, Lindsay. I think that is the new startup landscape. Is recycling has become, as you know, with tying back into Sharina's circular economy discussion. Building a recycling business. I mean, you're looking at one of the leading entrepreneurs right below me on the Zoom screen, but also lithium-ion battery recycling businesses are springing up, wind turbines. I mean, using technology and engineering to solve these problems is what we do. And now we're just applying it to solve problems on a system that is even better than the one we had before, but we can make it better. That's what we can do.
Yeah, but there is some, I think the original question, does it take more energy to produce a wind turbine than it generates? I think that is BS, and I think that is intentional BS.
I concur.
The on the recycling aspect, there is some truth in there. There is some truth there, but I'm confident that the industry will figure it out, because if there is a need and there's an opportunity and there is volume, they sort it out. And the same thing happened with lithium-ion battery pack. That market flipped. That market flipped quickly from a cost to being a positive.
Okay, so I'm going on that question still a little bit, but I do want to make one comment. Someone in the Q&A did comment that they weren't able to see, I think, all of Lindsey's slides. Lindsey, did you have more than one slide?
I did. I had 3 slides, and I'll send them to you when I have to jump off so that you can share those along with my email. If anyone was interested in chatting with me, feel free to email.
Okay, great, because I know that time's limited, but going along that theme a little bit more, are we running out of steel? Is that a worry?
Steel or metals?
The question I saw was steel.
Okay, I don't believe so.
No,
And again,
whatever.
recycling. Recycling is not only because it makes you feel less guilty in what you do with the materials. It becomes more and more an economic imperative to reuse all those metals, steel, you name it. So, and what we always say, half jokingly, why do you go for cobalt to the Congo if you can get it in Oklahoma City? And I think that's the whole premise of recycling. You want to reuse those components because it makes economic sense.
And as a geologist who has been involved in the mining business as well as oil and gas, what I can say also is there are significant resources of cobalt, lithium, graphite, vanadium, et cetera, in the US, in other parts of the world. And there are many opportunities for using those resources to help build the new energy economy as we backfill this need before we get to recycling. But really where the difficulty lies and where the engineering problems lie to be solved is not just in mining cobalt from the ground, but in turning it into that bespoke battery material that's required in making the lithium into the lithium carbonate or the lithium hydroxide and getting the layers just right and getting just the right size of graphite particle. So there is an additional step beyond just extracting it that we need to put our thinking caps on and figure out how to do well.
I'll just make a comment that, there is no zero impact energy system, right? They're all going to have an impact for sure. The impact that we're really trying to work on right now is the emissions issue, because it's really, truly speaking as a geologist, it is an existential crisis for the biosphere. Here's a question for any of you. What's the relative role of public versus private sector investment in accelerating the energy transition?
Well, I would just say, I think, we'll take Oklahoma, for example. Over the years, there's been numerous oil and gas incentives, and it gets citizens and the legislature in, crossways and in a bad way. There's been wind energy incentives that truly brought an industry that didn't exist before to the state. And here we are, number 3. So it works, but they have to work on tapering those off at the right time. And so I think with renewables, they pretty well exist without incentives and subsidies, and that's the key. And then I think once they can prove they exist without those, any sort of incentive from the government side is going to be, gravy. And then on the commercial side or the business side, just like some of the panelists have talked about, businesses are doing it for economic reasons and for social reasons. They know that their customers care about this. And so some of them do it simply to say they do it and that they have a green policy and that they're, making a difference in climate change, while others do it simply for economic reasons. So it's a little bit of both, but it can't simply rely on government subsidies or incentives, or it'll never work long term.
And I think government money is important in the beginning to get to a certain volume. And then industry will come in and they will work it out themselves, private money. But in the beginning, it is good to have government money because a lot of these technologies are volume games. Solar is a good example. And then there comes a tipping point, and then you can take the subsidies away and it will work by itself.
And I'll just add, take a look at what the market thinks. Look at NextEra passing ExxonMobil in market cap last spring. Look at the returns being an order of magnitude greater in most utility scale and renewable energy investments than currently in fossil fuels. So there is definitely a recognition that renewable energy makes economic sense.
I think stakeholders have begun to hold their companies accountable for what they're doing, the impact and the overabuse and use of our natural resources. And it's a real issue. And so when we're looking at the bottom line, private industry being many of these businesses being huge consumers of our natural resources, they have to be held accountable and something has to be done. I think few of us turn on our televisions now and don't see a commercial by Amazon about their goal to reduce or to become carbon neutral in a certain time frame. So we're beginning to see, I think it takes a collective effort, as I mentioned earlier. It takes government involvement. It takes private industry, and it takes us individually paying attention to what we can do as well.
Excellent. I agree. Thank you, Sharina. Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you, Edith. Thank you, Dirk. It's been wonderful to have you here.